It finally happened. For the first time ever, there are now going to be unions for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers. And you can see right here, right away, voters allow Uber and Lyft drivers to form unions in Massachusetts. In my opinion, Massachusetts is the most forward state when it comes to rideshare drivers and getting rights, protections, etc. And you can see that Massachusetts residents on Tuesday voted to give drivers for transportation networks, including Uber and Lyft, the option to form unions to conduct collective bargaining regarding wages, benefits, and terms and conditions of work. So going down here, when it comes to the exact proposition, 53.9% voted in the affirmative versus 46.1% for no. And this is pretty big because earlier this year, I talked before, that there's a landmark settlement that Uber and Lyft drivers basically would earn a minimum pay standard of $32.50 per hour in Massachusetts. And not just that, like I've said earlier in other videos earlier this year, not only are they getting $32.50 per hour in terms of the minimum hourly wage, but also things like paid sick leave, unemployment assistance, benefits, and a lot more. This is huge. I'm not going to lie. I'm a big fan of this. And I know, and I want to stress that yes, although Uber drivers and Lyft drivers can form unions now in Massachusetts, it's not perfect. So I do want to say that. This is not a perfect win across the board, but I think it is a huge win. How is it going to work out in practicality? We will have to see. I do want to say that because there are some terms that seem a bit iffy. There have been actually some controversy by Uber drivers and Lyft drivers actually going against this, saying, hey, although it seems good at first that we can form unions, there might be some negative side effects to that and negative drawbacks and negative aspects to that you might not expect. Now, we will have to see how it works out in practicality, but in my opinion, I think this is a huge win. This is a massive win for multiple different reasons. One, let's jump way back to the beginning of this year. The fact that in Massachusetts, like I've said in a bunch of videos already since it happened, truly is the most forward state for rideshare drivers. It is the best state. If let's say, and this happened actually on this channel, I've gotten a lot of comments of people saying, hey Mark, ridesharing is my thing. Like I'm an Uber driver, I'm a Lyft driver, you should be both to maximize your earnings. I want to just do ridesharing. That's what I passionately love. Where should I live? And right now, my number one answer is Massachusetts. I think that's the best place to get the most amount of benefits, protection, etc. I might also say maybe California as well. And the only reason why is I think the overall amount you may walk home with or drive home with, to use that analogy or pun or whatever, is probably going to be higher in California, especially if you look at the fact that if you live in California, you can drive for both Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego, and those three pay a lot per hour when it comes to rideshare drivers. Maybe a little bit more than like Massachusetts, let's be more specific, Boston, which is the best place to drive for in Massachusetts, of course. But when it comes to when you look at protection rights, Massachusetts is the best state for rideshare drivers, right? With what happened earlier this year, like we just touched upon, the minimum wage, basically you're getting benefits and you're getting the perfect middle ground, like I said before as well, of you not being an employee. And I think a lot of drivers, being honest, do not want to be employees. You're also not an independent contractor fully, because if you are just fully an independent contractor, you get taken advantage of. And like I've talked about in a bunch of videos, as we all know, Uber and Lyft does really go out of their way to take advantage of the drivers a lot. And they do so a lot. But now it's this middle ground that's been happening in a lot of other areas, a lot of other states. It's been a big talk as well. It's interesting because all these news stories I've covered on this channel, one thing you may notice as a common thread through all these news stories I've covered is more and more legislative bodies, if I'd say it like that, lawmakers, politicians, etc., have been looking at Uber and Lyft and saying, wow, this is actually something that's a bit of an issue. Like, they're not employees, they're not independent contractors, but they should get benefits. But then are they? So now it's becoming more of a topic of conversation all around the country, right? All around the country. And it's kind of funny because when things happened here in California, it was almost like all eyes on California for Prop 22. And then this happened in Massachusetts earlier this year of Uber and Lyft getting sued and auditors finding out, like, wait a minute, they owe hundreds of millions of dollars and all this kind of stuff. And now that unions have now finally been able to be happened. Now that unions are finally happening in Massachusetts, this is absolutely massive. This is big, honestly, because I think this is a step in the right direction. And yes, I do like to be transparent in all my videos that there is some negative aspects to it. And that's something I will discuss in future videos as we see how this kind of fully forms and we see how the unions truly get built and how things kind of work as unions go, right? Of course, it's one thing to read something on a piece of paper. It's another thing to see how it works in actual practicality. I think, though, at the end of the day, although, yes, there are some negative aspects of this, and yes, there is an argument to be made that this is not perfect, and I do want to say that, I think there's still a massive win in the right direction. And I think this could become a countrywide thing. I think that I could see a lot of states looking at Massachusetts, not only with what happened earlier this year, but then seeing, oh, wow, like these Massachusetts drivers now have a union, and you could be part of an Uber union and a Lyft union as a rideshare driver to get better bargaining rights, to get better protection, to basically be in this unique category, like I've said before in almost every video about this topic, of being an independent contractor, but with benefits. And I do think that's actually, not saying very rarely does this happen, but I think it is that unique instance of it being a win-win. I think it's a win for drivers because for independent contractors, you get to stay on that truly flexible schedule. You turn on the app whenever you want. You turn it off whenever you want. That's the best and biggest benefit for most rideshare drivers. They want to be able to drive how they want, when they want, with no warning to Uber and Lyft. Whether you're doing it full-time and you're like, hey, I can just do it whenever I want. And if I want to go to my daughter's dance recital, if I want to randomly meet up with friends, I don't have to ask my boss. If I want to go on a vacation, I can just do it, right? So that the flexibility is great. But two, for most people who are part-time drivers, they're like, hey, I can work around my schedule. If, let's say, you have an odd schedule, you could drive in between those cracks. If, let's say, you have a typical 9 to 5, you could drive, if you want to, maybe even before your shift or afterwards, or you drive on Friday, Saturday nights, or drive on the weekend, right? So I think people want that. That's the big win for drivers, is staying as independent contractors. And you also get the benefits, right? You get the benefits of what employees get. Things like health insurance are now on the table. Things like a minimum wage, things like paid sick leave, things like unemployment. These things are now being introduced to this unique new category. But in addition, I gotta say too, I think this is also a win for Uber and Lyft, because as we know, Uber and Lyft they're not the best companies. And I've talked before about that. I don't think they go into this, I'll be honest, in a truly negative way. I don't think it's like Uber and Lyft goes into it being like, oh, let's see how much we can take advantage of our drivers. But there are a lot of questionable things they do. I talked before in previous videos about algorithmic wage discrimination, where Uber and Lyft now is using AI to determine, like, okay, what is the minimum amount drivers are willing to get paid for this given ride. And they actually tested different drivers and noticed their thresholds. For some drivers, they realize they'll take any ride they can get, and they can take advantage of that by giving them cheaper rides. When for another driver, they realize, okay, we know they're not going to take the cheap rides. We're going to have to actually give them more money for the same ride. And for, let's say, one driver who's very strict about what rides they take, they may pay them $15 for a ride. But for a driver who takes anything, for that same exact ride, they might pay him $12 or $10. Because they know this driver will take anything. They'll just take whatever they can get. And therefore, they can kind of take advantage of that by paying them less for the same exact ride. And this has been shown in studies that for the same ride, they'll pay drivers differently depending on what they think they're willing to accept. Kind of annoying. So yes, Uber and Lyft is not perfect. But I do think this is a win for Uber and Lyft as well. Because let's be honest, for both Uber and Lyft, it kind of goes in the same category. Let's be honest. They want their drivers to stay as independent contractors. It is better for them. And I do think this is a win-win. It was interesting to me. This is one kind of unique thing that is kind of funny. Like, not saying this is a good or a bad thing, but when Prop 22 happened here in California, Uber and Lyft spent hundreds of millions of dollars in ads and marketing to make sure drivers stayed as independent contractors. The big question, though, here was, should drivers be independent contractors or employees? It was very black or white. In this case, though, which is really interesting, Uber and Lyft didn't really argue about rideshare drivers having unions. And in kind of a funny way, it seemed almost a bit suspicious. Like, I saw some news articles I was reading about where they're like, wait a minute. So Uber and Lyft seems okay with this. They're not arguing against unions. They're not spending all this ad money for rideshare drivers to have unions. What's going on? Like, why aren't they doing that? And I do understand that kind of argument where, like, okay, it's quiet, like, too quiet. Like, Uber and Lyft is not, they weren't going for it. They weren't saying, like, definitely unionize, but they also weren't going against it. And that's when it's kind of interesting being like, okay, so is there nothing going on behind the scenes? And like I said, there have been some articles written saying, look, we are for rights for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, but maybe this union proposition isn't the way to go. Granted, it went through. So now drivers can unionize. And I do think, like I said, there is some pros, there is some cons. That's definitely true. But I think this still is the right step in the right direction. And again, it comes down to this one fundamental principle I've talked about in so many videos, especially near the end of this year. I've noticed that things I think are slowly getting better for rideshare drivers. That yes, there's a long way to go in terms of just still getting paid the amount you need to get paid. Uber and Lyft taking out a bigger cut than ever before. Things being a bit more expensive, although gas has been shown to be down, which is kind of nice. So there are some pros and cons on both sides. But I think for the first time, I'm really seeing more and more of an upswing, way more of an upswing now, that drivers are getting paid and starting to get the benefits, the amounts that they really deserve. They're getting paid a little bit better as time has been going on, especially in the past 3 or 4 months. They're getting more benefits, especially in the past 3 or 4 months. The only unfortunate thing I will say, this is kind of like the really annoying thing when I do a video like this, though, is it kind of feels like being left out. It's like that SpongeBob meme when Squidward's looking out his window and SpongeBob and Patrick are running around, where it's like, okay, if you're in Massachusetts, you're like, let's go. But if you're not in Massachusetts, if you're in the other 49 states, or if you're in a different country, you may be looking at this being like, I mean, good for Massachusetts, but what about me? What about me in my state or in my area? Like I said before, the ripple effect is true, especially for ride sharing right now, where when one thing happens in one state, other states are looking. And when it comes to something as big and monumental as unions and rideshare unions, this is something that's not going to be a one-time thing. It's definitely not going to be a situation where everyone says, oh, good for Massachusetts, but we're all left hung to dry. Not the situation at all. It is definitely true that with this happening, a lot of other states are going to be looking, and I look at it very similar to any type of new thing, like when Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage, or when Colorado and Washington were the first states to legalize marijuana, and then other states start looking at that, right? Now, granted, very different subjects, very, very different fields, very different things in general, but for something like this, with ride-sharing being such a hot topic right now when it comes to the placement of employees and independent contractors, when it comes to the financial placements, when it comes to all these nitty-gritty, intricate things that comes with being a rideshare driver and the economics of the ride-sharing world, this is monumental. And this is something that is going to be a huge sign of things to come, not just for Massachusetts, which now can have unions, but for other states as well.